السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وأنزل علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. Today's motivational quote is sponsored by Sultan Mehmed II. He said, "To see the border of possibility, got to try the impossible." And that's exactly what he did. We're going to talk about the rise of the Uthmaniyin, the Ottoman Empire. Before you is a photo of really the jewel of really architecture in the world at the time. This is the Hagia Sophia. And this is a very iconic building that was part of an iconic city, Al-Constantiniya. The Prophet ﷺ said that لا تفتحن القسطنطينية فلنعم الأمير أميرها. So he said that you will surely enter into the city of Constantinople, and its leader will be the best of leaders, and its army will be the best of armies. So, of course, there are countless people that had attempted that before. As you enter into Istanbul, you'll notice there's a district right outside of the walls or close to the walls, which is Al Ayyub, and that's because Abu Ayyub al Ansari is buried there. And there are many others that tried over the years. None were successful except for Mehmet. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that he would be the one to do so. So we have lots to cover. This is a very critical part of Islamic history from the year about 1300 until 1600. And next time that we meet, we're going to be talking about the Mughal Empire. We'll talk about the Safavids and some of the other period, which is during the period, the beginnings of colonization in most of the Muslim world. So today we're going to tackle the rise of the Ottomans, Tamerlane al-Amir Timur, the conqueror, the rise and the decline of the Mamalik, the Mamluks, Islam in Spain, in Kashmir, in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, also in Philippines. We'll talk about the printing press. This is a controversial subject among Muslims, that why is it that we didn't have the printing press the way that, I mean, it was invented in the 1400s by Gutenberg, so what took so long? I think 1440 is the year that the printing press was invented. That was a long time ago. And then, of course, the beginnings of the Safavid Empire and the Mughal Empire. So the first part, of course, I have a photo from Ertugrul and Halime Sultan over there for the TV show. Did you know that that was the #1 show in Pakistan? The #1 show is a Turkish show. Go figure, right? It actually, I think, is the #1 show around the world. And I think more than 1 billion people have watched it, which is crazy. 1 billion people with a B. I have to admit, I have seen it as well, although it only happened because of COVID, because we were stuck in the house. I said, let me check it out. Once I started, I honestly, it was very aggravating to watch, because historically I was like, this is wrong, that's wrong, they made this up. But I just fell in love with the characters, right? They're just, the way that they put it together. Even the subsequent shows, they're not the same. The top is from a museum. The top photo is from a museum in Sot, which is the old head of the precursor of the Kai tribe before they started the state. And on the very bottom is the grave of Ertugrul Ghazi, who is the father of Osman. And of course, that's a national monument for them in Turkey today. So the real state didn't begin with them, even though that's what the show is all about. In the year 1299, Osman I, who's the older son of Ertugrul, ruled the Kai tribe of the Oghuz Turks. So as you know, the different branches of Turks that we have the Turks from the Mamalik, we have the different branches that we've seen in Central Asia. We've seen the Tatars, which are similar but not the same as Turks. And the Oghuz tribe, we'll see, is one of the most well-known Turks in the area. And the Kai tribe of course, is related to several tribes. There's more than 20 different tribes. But what they did is the reason they were successful is because in a very short succession, they led a series of raids on Byzantine cities that were located in Anatolia. And they took strategic moves in succession to take advantage of the fall of the great Seljuk Empire. So what happens is the Seljuk Empire is collapsing on the east. The Mongols are no longer a threat. So they devote all their attention on the Byzantines to their west. And by doing so, they were able to spread in two directions. They were able to go up north to the Sea of Marmara, and they were able to go to the west as well towards the Sakarya River. And so they start consolidating their power. But of course, there's still other Turkish tribes, in addition, in the east. The turning point is when they developed siege equipment, and it took more than 2 decades for them to develop this. Right? If you watch the TV show Osman, it looks like somebody woke up with the idea and it happened the next day. But actually, it took more than 20 years, and then eventually they are able to capture the city of Bursa. That is significant because 9 years later, they made Bursa their capital. It's also one of the food capitals in Turkey. A lot of people go there. This is the birth of Iskender kebab as well. If you visit Turkey, it's right across the water. So it's a little bit southeast of Istanbul. So a lot of people, even if they visit Istanbul for a short period, if you're interested in history, Bursa is very accessible and easy to visit. Here is a painting of Sultan Orhan. And Orhan is the son of Osman. And so when his father passes away, he becomes the sultan, and he has his younger brother, Alauddin, as his advisor. And his brother gives him the advice of what they've been following, which is that they should have a standing army of professional soldiers that are paid and salaried. But his chief vizier, who's going to take that post soon, he comes up with the idea of having janissaries. Okay? And janissaries are when you create an army that is comprised of Christian families, so young boys 10, 11, and 12. In the new areas that are conquered, they would actually compete with each other. So they never got to the point where they had to force people. I mean, theoretically, that could have been possible, but they didn't need to because it was such a prestigious position in which they would be paid, they would be well treated, they would be well educated and well trained, that the non-Muslim families actually, competed in order to get their children signed up and to be trained as part of this elite force. Now, one of the requirements and one of the criticism is that, of course, the Ottomans were extremely, probably out of all of the Islamic empires, were the most accommodating of minority religions. They had a millet system that would develop later on, in which Christians and Jews would operate independently. They had their own laws, they had their own educational institutions, they practiced their own places of worship. But in the case of janissaries, it was a requirement to have complete loyalty to the Sultan. And so because of that, in order to be part of the janissaries, you have to convert into Islam. Now, what this resulted is the largest freestanding army in all of Europe. Now, keep in mind, this is before the birth of the nation state. What's happening in England, right? England and France, they're in 100 years war. I mean, the dates are not exactly corresponding, but you get the idea. They've been fighting. France is trying to get rid of England, right? There are all these French-speaking areas that are under the influence of the British Navy. You have the Portuguese that are going around the whole world and trying to figure out where they're going to conquer. So Europe is kind of in disarray. So this allows the Ottoman Empire to really gain a lot of territory and gain a lot of strength. They reach Iznik, they reach Izmit, they reach Uskudar. 7 years later, the Karasi Principality, they take control of that as well, which is to the left. Then they cross over onto the other side, into the European side, and they take Gallipoli, which is in today Bulgaria and Greece, right? And so now they've reached on both sides, Europe and in Asia. And he makes another very strong strategic, of course, in the TV show, it's, there's a whole romantic thing about this, but I don't know historically how true that is. But we do know is that he marries the Tekfur, the governor, Kantek, I don't know if I can pronounce it. Kantek, I'm going to give it up. His daughter, Kezonis, his daughter. Greek names are tough, right? His daughter. And later on, he becomes the emperor. And so it just works out perfectly because initially he's not having to fight the Byzantines on the other side at the same time. But of course, Orhan is probably awkward at family get-togethers, but later on he attacks Gallipoli. So I'm sure his father-in-law is not entirely thrilled about that. But because of that, that allows him many years of peace with the Byzantines that allows him to consolidate his power on the east end. Okay, lot of expansion. There's pressure on the emperor in Bulgaria, Ivan Shishman, to be a vassal. So there's constant attacks, pressure on him to submit to the Ottoman Empire. And this also shows a new policy in which the Ottomans would keep the local leader intact and they would serve as a vassal state. And we see that they conquered Sofia, that's the capital of Bulgaria, Nice, which is in the bottom portion of Serbia. In 1389, there's the Battle of Kosovo, in which they take pretty much all of Serbia. So you have Macedonia, you have Montenegro, you have Serbia, every Yugoslavia, the whole Balkans, so many different countries. Most of them are all conquered within that period. Now we have the Sultan Bayezid. He comes back to Anatolia. He makes peace with the Karamanids. And the Karamanids are the biggest tribe. They're actually bigger than the Kai tribe. And they are in central Anatolia. And this is a very important move because by making peace with them, he doesn't have to deal with fighting on two different fronts. So he has peace in the east, he comes back to Bulgaria, and he attempts to conquer Constantinople. But Bayezid is not the one that the hadith is talking about. So he's not successful. The Christians, and this must be like the fifth or the sixth attempt in conquering Constantinople, people started to say that this is the unconquerable city, that there's no way that anyone can conquer it because of the chain that crosses the Golden Horn, because of the very, very high walls, and because of all of the defensive measures that are taken in Constantinople. Also, they believe that this is, the Christians believe that this is a holy city. And so the idea that it could be conquered, right, it's kind of the way that we feel about Mecca. It's like we don't have any forts, there are no defensive measures, but like, is anybody going to take over Mecca? No, it's not possible, right? Even when Abdul Muttalib, right, when they came, Abraha came with the army to attack, and he started talking to them about his property. Everybody was offended. They said, "You're worried about your property. You're not even worried about the Kaaba." He said, "The Kaaba has a Rabbun Yahmi." Okay, the Kaaba has its Lord. He's going to take care of the Kaaba. I need to take care about my stuff. Okay, so because nobody's going to save that but me. So he wasn't worried because he knew that Allah will take care of it. In 1396, the Ottomans faced what could have been a very dangerous moment in which there was a new crusade. And this is actually the very last time, unless if you include the Battle of Vienna, which I probably wouldn't because it wasn't a crusade. But they send troops from all over Europe for this battle. And the Ottomans, it's not a decisive battle, but the Ottomans are successful. And so because of that, it prevents the crusade from picking up any steam. Then there's the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and this comes out of nowhere. They're not expecting this. They're busy with the Byzantines on the west. Guess what happens? Ankara is besieged by Timur. Who's Timur? Where did he come from? He busts into the scene out of nowhere, and suddenly he is attacking Ankara and Sivas, and actually captures the two sons of Bayezid. They actually have a crisis afterwards to figure out who's the right sultan. So the Ottoman Empire goes from the height of heights and comes crashing down just within a couple years. Now, before we continue with the Ottomans, we have to interject with what's happening in the rest of the world. In India, remember we talked about the Delhi Sultanate. So now we have, and we talked about the Khiljis also. Now we're going to talk about a different dynasty, the Tughlaq dynasty, that took place. It was founded by Ghiyazuddin Tughlaq, who was the governor of Punjab. So not somebody who was necessarily of royal blood, but he rose to power after Alauddin Khalji. And he extended into the Hindu kingdoms from running across northern India all the way. And many of these Delhi Sultanate, it goes from the west all the way to the east, all the way until reaching Bengal, right? Because as you remember, in Bengal, at the end of the Delhi Sultanate, they ended up having a separate Bengal Sultanate. We talked about that last week, so we won't repeat that. But what they didn't cover is southern India. Southern India, that whole Deccan plateau, that comes in much later during the times of the Mughals. And even in the time of the Mughal, it wasn't the entire, most of the South India was doing its own thing, right? They're completely separate, different culture, different traditions from North India. He is very, very successful militarily. However, he is not a good administrator. It is a train wreck. He imposes very draconian crop and land taxes, very high taxes, especially on non-Muslims. He causes people to just give up. They say, well, if we're going to pay such high taxes, we're not even going to farm. So they run out into the jungles. What happens when people stop farming on a macroeconomic level? Now what happens? There's a crisis of food. Exactly, there's a crisis of supply because the supply drops, and so what that does is it shocks the whole system, and now there is a food shortage and the price of food goes way up. Then there's a famine that takes place, there's robbery. Also, he created this fiat currency system in which instead of using gold and silver, they would use copper and brass and other materials. What happens when you use the other materials? Every Tom, Dick, and Harry comes up with a counterfeit factory in their basement. So that's what happened. Everybody was making fake currency. It caused. So, he was a little bit too smart in that he came up with all these like off the wall ideas, and it almost caused collapse. And some people, they say that because he was very unpopular, some of the Hindus, they point to him as an example of a bad Muslim ruler. But the reality is that he did not discriminate really between Muslims and non-Muslims. He was also brutal to Muslims. A lot of the killings that are described in history, they were completely arbitrary, and they had nothing to do with that. And in fact, we notice that in all of the empires, whether it's the Delhi Sultanate, the Tughlaq dynasty, the Khaljis, or the Mughals, most of the people in positions of bureaucracy, what religion are they from? The vast majority are always Hindu, and not only any Hindus, they're mostly from the Rajput class, or what I mean by that, they're mostly Brahmin. And these are the same families that for hundreds and thousands of years were ruling India. Even when the Muslim rule was taking place, the actual people that are running the government were always Hindu. And that was also for the sake of continuity, that the Muslim rulers, they didn't want to bring in any foreign administration. So they would keep all of the existing social structure. They didn't disturb the caste system. They didn't disturb the religious system and the cultural system that was there. And so in fact, even in the Mughal times, in this time period, only about 10% of India is Muslim. Most of the Muslims are in today what we would call Pakistan, right? And later on, Bengal, the conversions to Islam is very, very high, as we talked about last week. But at that time, it's mostly Punjab and Sindh are Muslim majority. But the rest of India, it has a very low Muslim population. Even in the Mughal times, it only reaches about 15%. And we see this is documented by a lot of the travelers, Ibn Battuta, a lot of the Indian historiographers, historians. They talk about who were in the positions, who were the wazirs, who were the ministers, and most of them were non-Muslim. Now, in the case of Tughlaq dynasty, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is a theory that Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he was influenced. By the way, everything that I mentioned is not Ghiyazuddin. This is Muhammad bin Tughlaq. who came after Ghiyazuddin. The theory is that he was influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, because he quotes Ibn Taymiyyah in some of his readings. So they said the reason he's like this is because the other rulers, they were influenced by Sufis, and he was more, there's no concept of Salafi or Wahhabi Islam, it doesn't exist at the time, but they said he was influenced by the Athari school, and he tried to implement some of the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah. I don't think that there's enough evidence of that, but this is one of the theories that people have, is that this is the reason that he was so harsh, is because he was trying to implement some of those ideas. Tamerlane is one of the most brutal, I wouldn't, you know what, it's not fair. I shouldn't even say one of the most. Tamerlane is the #1 killer in all of history. I think so. If you do the math, he killed the greatest percentage of the world population, even more than Genghis Khan, even more than Hitler, by a percentage basis, right? He killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 1 million people. Now, at the same time, or shortly before him, you had the Black Death, the Black Plague, which decimated 30 to 50% of the population. Then from the tribe of Barlas Khan, the Mongols, they moved towards Khorasan, and they started to adopt the Turkish traditions. As you remember, Genghis Khan, he has his 4 sons. They divide into 4 different khanats. Then from these, then you have the grandsons, and things kind of divide even more than that. Now what he does, Barlas Khan, he switches sides. He goes to Mughal Khan, who's starting his own little khanat, and he comes to the camp, and instead of fighting him, which is what he promised to do, that's what he told his tribe that he's going to do, he ends up switching sides, right? And he revolts along with Hussein, which is going to be his brother-in-law, who's one of the aristocrats, one of the nobles from the same tribe. Then Timur and his men, now that they have revolted against Mughal Khan, they become like bandits. So they're highway robbers. All they do is they keep attacking the Khan's troops, and eventually they lose a lot of men. They become just a few people. In 1363, he injures his right leg. Guess where the name comes from? So he's called Tamerlane in the West, Timur Lame, right? Ling, which is an indication that he is limp on his right leg. In addition, he lost a couple of fingers as well. On the top right is a picture from Uzbekistan. As you know, he was born in Uzbekistan. He passed away also in Uzbekistan. Samarkand was one of his capitals. And then below is an example of what his armor looked like from one of the museums. Here's a painting of Tamerlane. It shows the sheer willpower. That how is it possible that he created this dynasty out of nowhere, right? It's kind of like Genghis Khan. He has this final battle when he's just a few people. He's just a highway bandit. And what he does is he has his men burn campfires. So he surrounds them with fires to make it seem like there's a big camp. He ties leafy branches, attaches them to the horses, and he has the horses go around and cause dirt to go up into the sky. And what happens is it causes the enemy to give chase because they're intimidated by what appears to be a large army. And one of his opponents, he said that Timur vanquished with fire and he conquered by dust. So today we would say he used smoke and mirrors. And we see the smoke and mirrors as part of his strategy. A lot of what he did was to commit atrocities in order to strike fear in the heart of opponents, so that way they would give up. And we see the Ottoman Empire is to the left in the green. The Mamluks, they're doing their own thing. But the Timurid Empire has really taken over, and they are expanding in all ways and in all directions. You see to the east Delhi, and you see to the west that they're approaching into Anatolia. They have all of Sham, all of Syria, all of Harran, all of Iraq, and they have entered into Georgia. Now, towards the end of his life, he marches through India. He dispatches Pir Muhammad to Multan, and after a 6-month siege, the people in Multan, which is the famous city of saints, right? They are so desperate for food that they resort to cannibalism. That people have nothing to eat in order to, people are literally dying from starvation. They have to eat their own dead. And then after, at a certain point, they had to give in. And so they succumbed to him, and they continue into North India. They reach outside of Delhi. He has 10,000 horsemen, 30 to 40,000 infantry, but there are 120 elephants. Okay. So what he does is he takes camels, he puts on the camels he takes bundles of dried grass, attaches it to the camels. So when the elephants see the dried grass, they're attracted to that. Okay? Kids, don't try this at home, right? So what he does is the camels, he causes them to panic, they run around, the elephants run after the camels, and then they fall into the traps of sharp objects. And by doing so, the elephants get impaled, the troops get impaled, and he basically destroyed the army by doing so. So again, smoke and mirrors, very creative, ingenuitive ways of approaching the battle. After they conquered Delhi, the locals, they get into a fight with the invading army. He ends up sacking the entire city. He stays outside of the city for 2 weeks. He gives his troops a green light that you guys do whatever you want to do. There's a huge number of people killed. The vast majority, almost everyone, very few Muslims at the time. In Delhi, it's almost entirely a Hindu city. They outnumbered the invaders 10 to 1. And according to the accounts from that period, they burned their houses, they burned their wives and their children, and they attacked the invaders in a frenzy, but it was to no avail. So this is also part of the Hindu tradition that you see, is that it's better to die with dignity by burning than rather by having an undignified end. And so they do that. Okay. Now he goes from Anatolia to India, and he continues from Delhi. He conquers West India, and by the way, he passes away along the way, and we'll talk about his son in just a moment. Huge amounts of loot. India is like the crown jewel. The Mongols, they never entered India. Alexander the Great never entered India. The fact that Timur enters into India is crazy because nobody else could do it, right? And the fact that it seems like he entered so easily. He takes control of West India. He takes the surviving elephants from the Golden Sparrow, and fortunately, he stops. He doesn't go deeper into India beyond that. But what he now happens is he goes through Central Asia and through the Middle East in what is known as the pilgrimage of destruction. This kind of guy, you don't want him to perform Hajj, okay? The best thing he can do is stay at home. Because he goes on a Hajj, and they named it the pilgrimage of destruction. Hundreds of thousands dead. Every time he went to a city, more than a dozen cities were sacked, and most of the people died as a result. Along the way, he goes through Persia, and he interacts with the Prince Miran Shah. Okay, so Miran Shah is one of the great, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the great grandsons of Genghis Khan. And he ruled over Persia. He falls into very decadent ways. Now, Miran Shah is going to come up later when we talk about Babur, right? When we talk about the Mughals. And he's very extravagant, right? Now, the reason that he's like that is because he's drunk most of the time. And this is the thing that I warned you when we started about Islamic history. Find half of these guys are drunk, right? But it's haram. Why are they drinking? But that's the thing, is that the reason people are like, why is the ummah weak? Why are we having problems? Well, there you go. I mean, when you have very corrupt leadership, then you're going to end up with these type of situations. But Timur was concerned that the people in Persia might revolt against Miran Shah, so he deposes him. Now you have royalty without any territory. So later on, that's going to come up. Then Timur, he attacks Georgia again. And as you know, Georgia is a place also which during the fall of the Ottomans becomes a very tenuous place, like Armenia. Relations between Muslims and Christians are very tough. And part of it goes back to these crazy tyrants. Timur, he gives people the choice to accept Islam or find themselves at the end of a sword. And the irony of Timur is that he viewed himself as the protector of Islam. How it's possible, because there was nothing Islamic about him, but this is genuinely what he thought, that I am out there conquering and protecting Islam, right? I'm the ruler that represents Muslims. Now, the tensions, they start to rise between him and the Ottomans. They're very tense letters that are exchanged between the two. And then he sieges Sivas, which is an Ottoman city, and it falls. Now you have, this is right leading up to the Battle of Ankara, and this is a great surprise to the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid because he was not expecting that. In fact, he was so busy in the West, he wasn't even considering that this could happen so easily. Now, just a quick note about what's happening on the individual level, which is that there is a huge expansion of the Sufi tariqas, which we spoke about last time, but now there's a proliferation of the different types, right? We talked about Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, Abu al-Hasan al-Shadhili out in the west in Morocco, but now you have a rise in the Naqshbandi and the Kibrawi. So these two, they focus on dhikr, as most of them do. But what's interesting is the two that I'm mentioning, they reject sama. So sama is the idea of having religious music. So the incorporation of instruments, and in many cases, these kind of instruments are meant to simulate a kind of spiritual exuberance, right? That somebody will be majdoob, somebody will kind of be present, but not actually be present. They will have an outer body experience. But these ways are a little bit more orthodox than especially the Naqshbandi tariqa is more orthodox than the Kubrawi way, which is a little bit more universal, which is why it was adopted by many people that were formerly Buddhist or that were formerly Hindu, or the Refai tariqa, right? Same, I share my first name with that, which has, which embraces a lot of the other practices, which according to most of the scholars, go outside of the Quran and the Sunnah. So for a person which is adhering to the Sharia, they would say now the spirituality, it's great, it's wonderful connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but now you've taken it too far, right? But historically speaking, these Sufi orders, the Naqshbandi, the Kibrawi, the Qadiri, the Chishti, those two especially in subcontinent, they spread into Russia, China, India, and Europe. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are some of the Sufi practices. One of the names that is used, people, they've heard the song like Mast Qalandar, right? So the word Qalandar is used to describe having this exuberant spiritual experience, and this becomes very controversial among a lot of the ulama, a lot of the scholars, myself included, which, I think that the early tasawwuf, the early Sufism that we talked about, that which was practiced by Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, by al-Junaid al-Baghdadi, by al-Muhasibi, this is the type of Sufism which complies with the Quran and the Sunnah, which is based on purity of the heart. The later ones become more ritualistic because each tariqah has a silsila, it has a chain, and then within that chain you have a pir and murid. You guys know that system, the pir and murid, right? So you have the sheikh and then you have the murid who's the discipline. And what ends up happening is there can be reverence of the wali or the pir, and people will, even the pir says divorce your wife and the guy will divorce his wife, even though of course any alim will be like, no, that's crazy, how could you do something like that? But people will do that because of their devotion to the spiritual practice. But balance is, the main thing. But it's important to notice that the vast majority, historically speaking, the vast majority of Muslims, Islam entered those nations because of these Sufi awliya and because of these disciples. So, as a matter of history, probably most of the expansion in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in India, in Chechnya, in Ukraine, all of this was because of these Sufi tariqas. So, if we don't mention it, then our understanding of history would be very incomplete. Now, we talked about talking about Timur's son. Now, he is a very interesting character because Timur, he just wanted to take money and run. But Shah Rukh Mirza, he is described by one of the historians that unlike his father, he ruled as an Islamic sultan. And this is very interesting because we notice the Ottomans, they ruled as a sultan, right? Shah Rukh Mirza, he ruled as a sultan. But when people, they put on the hat of conqueror, that's when they commit atrocities. Because that means they don't want the city to stay intact. They want to destroy the city. But if you're going to rule a city, then of course you wouldn't want to destroy it because now you want to enjoy the benefits. You want the economy to be intact. So he's exalted as, he's known as a person of great piety, diplomacy, modesty, and one of the model Islamic rulers that repaired a lot of the damage caused by his father. Some people might say, how is it possible that he's so great and his father is so crazy? Some people say that Timur was actually insane. I don't know. I have no way of proving. We're not going to send him for a psychological evaluation, but it fits all the criteria. I think it makes the whole story make a lot more sense. These photos, these two pictures, are actually pictures that I just took from our January trip. Anybody know where these two pictures are from? Any guesses? It's in Cairo, right? Where in Cairo? It's not a building that was made by the Mamluks, but these are two Mamluk minarets. They have the most beautiful minarets. This is from Al-Azhar University, and this is from the entrance of the Barbers. That's the most famous entrance to Al-Azhar. The Mamluks, they came from, not from Oghuz, but from another one of the 20 or so tribes. But this is all the way from the side which is close to Chechnya. So also Turkic, but from a whole different area. In the 7th Crusade under Louis VI, he invades Egypt, and the Ayyubid Sultan ends up defeating the Crusaders in Al-Mansura in 1250. We talked about all of this. Then what they do is they create a system in which they have trained soldiers that join the Mamluk hierarchy. Now, this is very important because people talk about the international slave trade. They talk about Arab and Muslim complicity in the international slave trade, all of which is true, right? There were Muslims that were involved in the selling and procurement of slaves to the Americas. On the other hand, and at the same time, the way that slavery was practiced in the Muslim world is very, very different from the way that it was practiced in the colonies. The brutal way in which it was practiced in America and in the other colonies is very different from how it was in the Middle East. In fact, the slaves were part of the society, and in the case of the Mamalik, they actually were rulers, right? Because they had so much access to wealth and to influence within the society that they were able to give themselves Arab names, bestow titles on themselves, and a big part of their prestige is the fact that they were successful against the Crusades. They protected Mecca and Medina. They recaptured Akka and Beirut and Haifa and Cyprus. And so the Mamalik actually rose from being slaves from way out in Central Asia to being at the height of the world. Remember, Baghdad in 1258 was destroyed. So Egypt kind of emerged as the center of the Middle East at that time. And has anybody seen this place? This is the famous Green Dome, which was built by the Ottomans, but it was replaced. It was to replace the original wooden dome that was built by the Mamaliks. by the Mamluks, and right next to it is, anybody see these two minarets? The pencil minaret, let's go with the easy one. Who built that? That was built by Sultan, I think, Abdul Hamid, um, uh, and it is constructed right by Bab as-Salam, by the entrance in which you greet the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the one by the green dome is known as the minaret of Al-Baqiyah, right, which is facing the cemetery of Al-Baqiyah. For those that went on the Umrah trip, we mentioned how it is tilted at an angle away from the dome because there was a fire in the, I think in the 1800s. No, it must be before then, during the Mamluk time, so in the 15 or 1600s, and they determined that they should have it angled away from the building, so that way if there's a fire, it would not collapse onto the grave of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the fact that they were kind of the safeguarders of Medina and Mecca is very important. Now the Ottomans, they take on the Mamluks, they take on Timur. Mehmed I, he consolidates Europe and Anatolia. Frequent conflicts with Venice, Serbia. Venice, as you know, is its own kingdom, right? So Venice is ruling the seas, and they rule a lot of the surrounding land. Serbia, Hungary. In 1444, Murad II, he faces the Crusaders at the Battle of Varna. This takes place in Hungary. They're led by one of the great Hungarian leaders, John Hunyadi, and Mehmet II, who initially becomes the Sultan when he's just a kid, and then orders his dad to come back because he's the Sultan. So he's like, well, I'm giving it back to you. He becomes the Sultan right after the abdication before Varna. Then there's an attempt to defeat the Albanian. He's very famous, and if you go to Albania, you'll see that they have statues of him everywhere. Skanderbeg fights the Ottomans, but he's able to be successful after many years. So what ends up happening is Albania, North Macedonia, Greece, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia. They all become part of the Ottoman lands, and they remain that way for an extended period. Now you might ask, but how come those areas are not Muslim now? Most of the places that I mentioned, if you go to Albania, for example, is probably about 80 something percent Muslim, right? My wife's cousin's husband is Albanian. You guys have met him. And of course, they went through brutal communism and a crazy dictator, but they're still Muslim somehow. How's that? And same with Macedonia. How come places like Kosovo and Albania are Muslim, and of course Greece and Belgrade are Serbia, and Hungary and Austria are not? Why is that? The reason is that some of the places were administered by the Ottomans directly, and other places were vassal states in which they were paying taxes to the Ottomans, and in reality on the map it shows Ottoman lands, but Islam did not really enter into the society because it was directly ruled by those vassal leaders. Okay, Mehmed II. He has this great sheikh, Akshamsuddin. He's an influential scholar. He inspires Mehmet when he's very young that he should focus on Constantinople. He signs peace treaties with Hungary, with Venice, and everybody's like, oh, this is great. This teenager, he's making peace with everybody. He's making peace because he's getting ready to go to Constantinople, which is also brilliant. It shows that you can't be putting out so many fires at the same time. In the year 1453, very famous year, he comes with 80,000 troops and 100 naval ships. This is a huge force. He comes with cannons that actually rival the ones in Europe. They're more powerful than what Europe has seen. He has a Christian cannon maker, Orhan, that designs these and engineers them. And this is something that the previous sultans lacked. And as a result of that, they're successful in their conquest. How did they manage to do it? What they ended up doing is, because there was a chain going across the Golden Horn, they could not come from the Sea of Marmara because they can only come by ship. From the Bosphorus, there's the train, there's the chain. What they did is they cut down trees, they laid down tracks, they oiled these tracks, and they physically pulled the ships uphill and across the land in order to reach the strait. And because they did so, they were able to face the walls that had the least defenses, because nobody expected that they would be exposed, and that resulted in them being successful. That's an example of one of the cannons that they had, and below that is one of the cisterns that is located right next to the Hagia Sophia. They have basilicas that are underground. It's very beautiful. Yeah, it's kind of like Harry Potter with the Chamber of Secrets, kind of looks like that. And this is the hadith that we mentioned, right? Okay. This is the Hagia Sophia, which is I think, is one of the most beautiful places on earth. The scale and the height is just unbelievable. The architecture at the time, it was ahead of its time by thousands of years. And one of the things that I wanted to demonstrate, it's now been converted to a masjid. That was a big controversy. In fact, it was a state-owned property. So when the Ottomans conquered in 1453, all of the state properties transferred to part of the ghanima. And so the sultan is entitled to 1/5 of the property that transferred. Rather than keeping it himself, what he did is he created a waqf, an endowment, and he said that this will be a masjid forever. Those deeds transferring it from the Byzantines to the Ottoman government, and then from the Ottoman government to the sultan, and then to the waqf, they all exist. So we have copies of all of these documents. Now, people might dispute that, and they would say, well, it's a church, so it shouldn't be. But that's not how the world operated at the time, right? It was a national church, so it was part of the national state-owned property, and that was the norm at the time. It was not like a local building or a local church. And the Ottomans, they didn't do that to any of the other churches that were in Istanbul. All the Christians, they continued to practice their religion, but because it was a state-owned property, for better or worse, that's what used to happen at that time. I wanted to show you an example on the bottom left of what some of the beautiful mosaics are. This is, I think, the birth of Constantine that is depicted in there. All of this was preserved. In all of these 100 years, they did not destroy any of the mosaics. Andalusia at this time in Spain is going through a lot of tumult. In 1233, the Nasarid kingdom of Granada is created. As you know, you had the Murabitun, then you have the Muwahidun. They have a couple of, it started with the Umayyads. Each one is falling. Why? Because there's a rise of Christian kingdoms. The Christian kingdoms are becoming more powerful, they're more militarized, and they've been successful. All that's left is the kingdom of Granada that is under the Muslim rule, but wow, is it amazing. I mean, I've traveled around the world. The Al-Hamra is the most beautiful building that I have ever seen in my life. If you want a depiction of what Jannah looks like, just go there. The gardens, the architecture, the design, the thoughtfulness, and every place that you go to, you see one phrase: La ghaliba illallah. They say, there is no one that can overcome except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the state motto, which is kind of like, don't even try and beat us, right? It's an indirect way of saying, La ghaliba illallah. Okay. Islam, it enters into Kashmir. Mahmud of Ghaznavid Empire, he tried twice. Both times, guess what? He got snowed out. So they had a snow day, he quit. The Ghurids, they didn't even try. So what ends up happening, it's ruled all this time by the Lahore Raj dynasty, by a Hindu dynasty. Then there is a Tibetan prince that takes refuge in Kashmir. Then lo and behold, he meets one of the Sufis that we talked about. He converts, he builds the first masjid in Srinagar. And then after him, you have Shah Mir. He starts the dynasty of the Swat Valley. And he is actually a descendant of one of the famous stories in the Gita, right? So he is kind of like part of this like noble blood in the Hindu culture. But then these two great, historical figures, they both convert into Islam, but the people are still not Muslim. right? So even though the ruler is Muslim, that doesn't mean that the people become Muslim. Hyder Shah comes after that. He takes the title of Sultan Shamsuddin. And so what he does is he starts to introduce Islam and Persian culture into Kashmir, but it's only when Khwaja Sayyid Ali Hamadani comes from Hamadan, from Persia, and enters into Kashmir that the local population becomes truly exposed to Islam. The reason I'm saying that is because consistently I mentioned before that it's mostly the Brahmin Hindu leaders that are the ministers and the wazirs. And Sanskrit all this time has been the official language. So Persian has not been introduced. Urdu, of course, has not really been developed at that time, and it's not spoken in Kashmir anyway. So what happens is Hamadani is escaping from Amir Timur in the year 1381, and he has 700 students that are well educated. He gives Qutbuddin, who comes after Shamsuddin, his turban, which gives him legitimacy. It's a kind of endorsement. And at the same time, there's a movement within Hinduism. Lala is preaching a very simple version of Hinduism that does not emphasize on idol worship, that is more connected with the concept of God, which is a kind of a spiritual version of Hinduism that finds a lot of popularity within Kashmir. And indirectly, it actually leads to more people becoming Muslim. Because when they let go of the idols, then it's kind of like an intermediate step. So they go from like hardcore, or you can say orthodox Hinduism, then they become more spiritual, and then from there, a lot of people, after a period of time, they became Muslim. Now, Sheikh Hamadani, he was a great wali, somebody who was very close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, widely revered and respected. But he also changed the economic situation for the people in Kashmir. Similarly, in Indonesia and Malaysia, anybody know where this picture is from? Isn't it amazing? This masjid has been around for a while. This is in Jakarta. This is Masjid Istiqlal, right? Which is one of the largest masajid in the world. And this is the prayer hall. The right side is for the men, and the left side is for the ladies, which I also think is a nice concept, the way they have it set up. They have traders from Gujarat, from Vietnam, from Hadramaut, coming from Yemen. And what ends up happening, the main vehicle is actually intermarriage. Because what ends up happening is that sometimes not only would your wife or your husband convert and become Muslim, but then your in-laws' family will also be affected. And that started to happen. That the in-law family, the surrounding social network would also become Muslim. They were also influenced by the Malacca Sultanate in the Malay Peninsula. There were a lot of Brunei Sultanate also started. Then there was a great Sheikh, Sayyid Abdul Aziz, right, that influenced one of the leaders in Indonesia, and he became Muslim. Everything is wonderful until guess who appears at the scene? European colonizers, of course. The Portuguese, they arrive in 1511. They start with the Dutch East India Company. It's actually more than 100 years before they start to colonize directly. The East India Company, the West Indian Company, the Dutch East India Company, all of these are corporations that are saying, well, we want to trade with you. We just want to make money. But in reality, there's a colonization agenda. Islam spreads to Sri Lanka. It starts with Arab traders that arrive at the time of the Sahaba. Isn't that amazing? From a very early time, right? So even you see the coastal areas of like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Sri Lanka, they receive Islam a lot earlier than some of the places that are inland. And that's because of the coastal connection. The Portuguese, when they arrive in the 1500s, they attack the Sri Lankan Muslims first, because they have trading networks with Arabs and with Indonesia and Malaysia. So Muslims in Sri Lanka is against the colonial interest. So they go after the Muslims. But because of the good relationship between the Sinhalese, the Tamil, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and the Hindus, Muslims find refuge in other non-Muslim Sri Lankans. They go to the central highlands, they go to East Province. Actually, we have some of our community members are from places like Kandy and other parts of Sri Lanka that became populated because of that. I never asked them their history, but I'm guessing that it's because of this. And later, there's more migration from Java, from Malay, from Indonesia, from India, mostly from South India. As you know, in 2019, there was a terrible Easter bombing that happened in Sri Lanka. And this has resulted in more tension within the country. We know during COVID, they had the restriction on the burial of Muslims. But we hope that this is going to change, inshallah, because the history has been very positive between Muslims and non-Muslims there over time. Islam in Philippines, also, there's a Sufi missionary. He established the masjid, the first masjid in Philippines in 1380. Zheng He is a Chinese captain of a huge delegation of ships. His ships are 5 times bigger than the ships that were brought by Christopher Columbus. And he travels around the world and he creates, this is for the Chinese government at the time, I don't remember the dynasty, and he establishes Muslim communities in many of the countries that he visits, because many of the sailors that came with him were Muslim as well. The printing press we can talk about later, but the short version here is that a lot of the Ottomans, they had a ban based on Sultan Bayezid in 1485. The reason he did this is he's worried that if people are too educated, what's going to happen? In 1440, the Gutenberg printing press was invented. What happened within 100 years? The Protestant Reformation. So when people start getting too much information, what's going to happen? People are going to start rebelling, right? Similarly, in the American Revolution, a big part of it is, the printing press. That was a big part of it. So there's a long story there, which we'll talk about another time. Next time, we're also going to talk about the rise of the Mughal Empire, Sultan Babur. We want to refute a lot of the false information that is said about the Mughal Empire. They were successful over the Lodi Sultan in 1526. They defeated an empire, an army that was twice the size, but they developed one of the most advanced governments. It was efficient. It was tolerant of people of all government, of all different religions, very extensive commercial activity. The taxation system was progressive, right? In a time in which that concept didn't really exist. And similarly, in the Safavid Empire, Ismail I, he also used gunpowder and created a very modern bureaucracy. So also a reminder that Nifs Shaban, the Shabi Barat, is coming not this Saturday, but the one afterwards. We have a special program starting with Iftar on Saturday the 24th. So we'd like to invite everybody to please come if you can. Okay. We covered 300-400 years. Was it fast enough? Alhamdulillah. So let's see if there are any questions. We can take them, inshallah, briefly. Brief questions, please. We have the Zoom open as well in case you have any questions. Yes. Alhamdulillah. Yes.
It's what the Hashashin, doing before conquering a city, they massacre one city and they enter freely into the other one.
It's different. The Hashashin, they are like they're more like ninjas, right? So they come into the city behind the scenes. They're engaged in espionage. So instead of killing everybody, it's too big of an impact. They get in and get out. So the Hashashin, what they would do is they will get rid of the guards, or they will get rid of the minister, anybody who's in a strategic position, right? And then they get out without anybody even noticing that they were there. Whereas Timur, why was he killing? It looks like he's crazy, but most likely he wasn't crazy. Why was he killing everybody? He only killed the people in the cities that resisted. So by killing 100,000, 150,000 people in a city of people that resisted, what happens the next time? You go somewhere. It's a scare tactic. It's a way of intimidation. They even took the rebels, he cemented them into the wall. of the city in Persia? Because you're just walking down the street and you're like, oh, that's what it looks like if you go against the ruler. He made a pyramid of skulls, yes. And there are modern examples of this. Hopefully, I won't get in trouble here. But the father of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, when Hama started to have an uprising, what did he do? He didn't just level it. He ordered the air force of the Syrian army from the air to bomb their own city. So that way, and after they bombed Hama, they never rebuilt the city. Because normally after there's a natural disaster, you rebuild the city. Why did they keep the city destroyed? Exactly. So everybody remembers. Well, if you have a Arab Spring type rebellion, this is what's going to happen. So it's a kind of intimidation.
There is also one thing, one anecdote. The Ottoman, when they are siege Vienna, and then when they left.
Yes, we're going to get to that inshallah next time. The Battle of Vienna. Yeah, the Battle of Vienna is one of the key points. After the Battle of Vienna, that's when the Ottomans. So the Ottomans are still going up in power. Suleiman is probably the last before the empire starts to decline. So we're going to discuss that inshallah next week. After the Battle of Vienna, they were always on the defensive with Europe after that. I've heard that. Guys, this is one of those things you get in WhatsApp, right? So I want to see some hard evidence that the croissant was in order to celebrate. Because I've heard too many theories that it's the cross and they were eating it because the Ottoman flag has the crescent, but I need to see some evidence. If anybody has it, please send it my way. I'm from New York. Bagels are always going to be okay. Yeah. Kosher and halal, okay?
Assalamu alaikum. We are several Kashmiris here, so it will be important to mention that Sheikh Ali Hamadani, rahmatullah Allah, he came Kashmir around 1376. He died in 1984, actually, while leaving Kashmir. He came from Hamadan, and he came through Silk Road, from Central Asia.
Yes.
And he was passing through Kashmir Valley. He saw a very beautiful valley, and there were Hindus and Buddhists that time.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, Shahabuddin was
after Shamsuddin.
Yeah, after Shahabuddin was the king there.
Yes, sir. Qutubuddin.
After Qutbuddin was Shahabuddin.
That's right. Shahabuddin, he's the third one.
Exactly.
That's right, yeah.
So what he did, there was in 2014, the United Nations, they established a research project. Who was the greatest leader in last several centuries, like you mentioned, who built a nation without fighting? And they came out, it was Sheikh Ali Hamadani, rahmatullah alayh. So you saw the picture, that is where in Kashmir,
yes,
he stayed, actually, he did actually khalwa there for some, but he's not
that's
buried
at the bank
there.
of
He's
the river,
buried
yeah.
in Katlan. While leaving Kashmir, he died, and his body was taken to Katlan, where that was his will. But anyway, regarding when he came, and he was the greatest man, actually. He approached, he was the founder of Pashmina shawl industry.
Yes. Yeah.
So he was a very rich man, and he spent all his money for dawah.
Yes.
So when he came, he went to the Sultan, which was the Muslim, but Riaya, everybody was Hindu and Buddhist. They were not in Muslim. He went to the king and told him, your people are very poor. There was nothing, no industry, nothing actually. He said, I want to change the condition of your people. He said, why do you do that, and how do you do that? He says, I do that because these people are very, very poor, and you will become rich.
Yes.
And I will spend my money. And he has actually, we have a friend here from Thrall. He bought his space in Thrall. He bought land in Thrall and make a madrasa there actually. But that was one of the part. So what he did is he he brought 700 technocrats from Central Asia, and they were all given the duty. They were all very
and they were training all the
learned
local
scholars
people.
and all
Yes,
that.
that's
And
right.
they taught the people first the handicraft.
Yes.
So what we are still Kashmir is making their living is paper mache, carpet weaving, and walnut wood. You probably have seen most.
Yes, of course.
And they still are. We are still making, most of the Kashmiris are making their living.
It's the
from
best
that.
quality in the world. Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
And
mashallah.
then in few years' time, the condition of the people, two years, 3 years, condition of the people improved. And then he gave them, actually later on, he put schools around. And Dean came at the, and there is actually the reason I'm telling you, Dr. Iqbal, Sir Muhammad Iqbal, he did a lot of research on, and the United Nations, they mentioned that his poem about Sheikh Ali Hamadani has immortalized Sheikh Ali Hamadani. It is actually, it started Sayyidu Sadat. I don't know how many people know here the Persian. It is in Persian. He says, Sayyidu Sadat Salari Ajam, Dast o Memari Takdiri Umam. He says, you are the chief of the chiefs, you know, Sardar from, and your hands make the destiny of Ummah. From Kashmir, he made that. So it is in United Nations, that poem, actually. It is a long poem, and I have it with me also.
Sure.
So he then actually gave them, and Dr. Iqbal writes, Dad ilm sunnat tahzibuddin. You gave the Kashmiris not Deen first. Deen came at the end. After, he says, ilm, the knowledge, sanat, the industry, tahzeeb, the culture, and at the end, when the condition of the Kashmiris, it became very good, and he told them, I am Muslim, and this is what Islam is. 80% population, within few days of Kashmiris, they changed, they converted to Islam without any fighting, without any sword, without anything. And that's why we are there. And all those 700 technocrats who came, he left them there. And every part of Kashmir you go, there is, they call it Astana. There is always these memorials of these people.
Of them.
So Sheikh Ali Hamadani is, and he has given us that, and he has given us, I think, the Awrad Fatihah.
Yes, mashallah.
That is the zikr, because people used to go to
I think that needs a special session, inshallah.
So,
Let's give everybody
so
a chance.
Inshallah, give us some time, and we'll say.
Inshallah. That needs a special time, inshallah, to discuss. Jazakallah.
Thank you very much.
I think there's 2 questions here.
Assalamu alaikum. So Sultan Mehmed Fatih's conquest of Constantinople is not just significant in human history, but it's also a fulfillment of the hadith and Muslim Imam Ahmed that you cited, which I would argue actually puts Mehmed Fatih at a higher maqam than other rulers than, let's say, Salahuddin, because they don't have a hadith. But that's not the point I'm making. But at this time, the Abbasid Caliphate is gone, right? And Mehmed Fatih is arguably the most influential and popular Muslim leader in the world, but he didn't claim to be Khalifa. It was his grandson Salim. So I'm just wondering if you came across any readings why Mehmed Fatih didn't make that claim.
The theory about why, and even the Ottomans, even later on when they do, they kind of, one Khalifa does, and then they forget about it for a couple hundred years, and then another one has a crisis. Abdul Hamid II is the most well-known person to claim to be the Khalifa, but it was a little bit late to claim the Khilafah. So the theory is that they didn't want to meet those standards. Because if you say the Mamluks are not claiming to be the Khalifa, in fact, they drag somebody from Iraq all the way to Cairo in order to give him a crown and say, you're the Khalifa, you're the fake Abbasid Khalifa. So I think it's too much of a burden. Then they can't be drunk. They have to look pious. Then the khutbah has to be given in their name. So I think they didn't really want the title. When they were at the top of the world, they didn't need the title of being the Khalifa, but that's my personal theory, that it's too much pressure without any of the benefits. There's a question here about talking about coffee being banned for locals during the Ottomans' time. That's next week, inshallah. We're going to give you guys the full history of coffee, inshallah. When Timurid came to India, what was the sixth ruling Punjab area? That's a good question. Were there six ruling Punjab area? I'm not aware of that. I will look into this. I'm not sure I understand the question. I don't know of the Sikh ruling Punjab at that time. I don't think so. They came in the Mughal time, yeah. Yeah, so that doesn't even exist. I think maybe next week the question will make more sense, inshallah. Yes, that's what I know, but I'm just trying to understand the question.
I will not even try to compete with you in 300, 400 years in half an hour or 1 hour. Just a little comment. Ibn Rushd, he also, Tamerlane called him, and he was quite scared that he would be killed. But he went over.
Ibn Khaldun, yes.
Yes, he came up there and he impressed Tamerlane. For whatever reason, he impressed him, and he became an advisor of Tamerlane.
That's right. And also, this is the best profile that we get about Amir Timur, because he spent about 3 weeks with him and he was 70 years old. So actually, they both were very complementary towards each other. And it also gives us some insight as to, what is it that Timur, and he was also there to try and negotiate, yes. Yeah. Yes, and the Muqaddimah, it's only, I think his actual book is like 6 volumes, right? So the Muqaddimah is just meant as an introduction to the rest of the book, right? So, how many volumes do you want? All right. Thanks everyone for all your patience. You have all been wonderful. May Allah increase us in knowledge and assist the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and unite all of us together. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.